Well, good afternoon, everyone who's joining us for today's colloquium. For those who are joining us for the first time, my name is Ed Vaughans, and I'm a professor of mathematics at Pomona College. And this is all part of the Pomona Research and Mathematics Experience, a colloquium that we've been running twice a week now for the last 4.5 weeks or so. Today, it is a great pleasure to introduce two faculty members from the Ohio State University, Ranthony Edmonds and John Johnson. So I'd like to introduce them and then also say a little bit about why they're both here today. Ranthony A.C. Edmonds is a Ross Assistant Professor at The Ohio State University. She earned her PhD in 2018 from the University of Iowa. While there at the university, Dr. Edmonds earned the Outstanding Teaching Assistant Award, the Graduate Teaching Fellowship, and the TAR Research Fellowship, which supported her work in implementing a partially flipped classroom. In 2018, she joined the faculty at The Ohio State University and was accepted into Project Next, a national program for new mathematics teaching faculty. Her research interests include commutative ring theory, evidence-based practices for the teaching of mathematics online, and using technology, equity, and diversity in mathematics. John H. Johnson Jr. is a program specialist and assistant professor at The Ohio State University. In 2019, he earned the Outstanding Staff Award from the Young Scholars Program at Ohio State, and in 2017, he earned the Distinguished Faculty Service Award from the Todd Anthony Bell National Research Center on the African American Male. Dr. Johnson's teaching interests include active learning and inclusive practices to promote and cultivate an environment which improves students' abilities to construct, organize, and demonstrate their knowledge of mathematics. He is currently serving as PI for the Building a Buckeye Calculus Community, a project geared towards understanding and implementing active learning in undergraduate mathematics classes. Dr. Edmonds and Dr. Johnson are both deeply invested in issues rooted in access to mathematics, particularly those from underrepresented backgrounds. In 2019, they developed the first service learning course in the Department of Mathematics at Ohio State entitled Intersections of Mathematics and Society Hidden Figures. This course aims to use an intersectional lens to study the role of mathematics as a tool for the advancement of society and to study diversity and inclusion in mathematical communities. They earned internal grants totaling $10,000 to support the development and implementation of this course, which was piloted for the first time in spring of 2020. I know I was really fascinated when I first heard about this course. I definitely wanted to learn more about it. So I'm really happy that the two of them are here today to talk more about this class and more about the individuals that they discussed in this course. So Dr. Edmonds, Dr. Johnson, thank you for joining us, and we really look forward to your presentation today.
Thank you. Thank you for the introductions, and thank you for just organizing this. And everyone who had a plan, a role in organizing this. We really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today, and thank you for everyone who is tuned in.
Yes, thank you so much for the invite, and we're very excited to kind of share some of the things that we learned from the course, especially in this role of community in mathematics and how it relates to Dorothy Vaughan, who was one of the hidden figures in the Hidden Figure story. So we figured we kind of start by giving just kind of some context for our course and then kind of move into like the main themes of our talk today. As Dr. Goins mentioned, we piloted a Hidden Figures course, Math 2194, now it's Math 2010 at Ohio State University. And it was based on the Hidden Figures book, The American Dream and the Untold Story of the Black Women Mathematicians Who Helped Win the Space Race by Margot Shetterly. And it's also, of course, an award-winning film. And you see the three actresses that played the three main Hidden Figures featured in the movie on this book cover here. In the actual book, of course, there were four Hidden Figures, plus many more besides, also talked about. But in the movie, three of them were featured. And this middle picture is a picture of the poster that we used that was designed by the College of Arts and Sciences to advertise our course, both within the college and with the broader university community. And it's kind of representative of the Hidden Figure story itself. And so you see the four women faces there kind of representing the four main hidden figures featured in the book. And then also there's this, looks like it's kind of like a clock in the middle. And that's actually a special type of slide rule, so like a compass slide rule. And we'll kind of mention that a little bit later as well. We had many goals for this course, but the three main ones we want to talk about today is that one of the first goals that we wanted to critically examine the relationship between math, technology, technological advancement, and society. The other thing, as Dr. Vaughn mentioned, we wanted to use intersectionality as its framework to discuss access to math communities and opportunities in STEM. And so intersectionality is this framework to kind of consider race, gender, and social economic status to kind of understand how those three strands interact and intersect to provide access to opportunity or lack of access to opportunity there. And so the idea roughly being that you just can't focus on one to get a complete picture of what's going on. And a part of this course, we really kind of focus on the four main hidden figures, but one of the other kind of key components of the course that we had our students connect with local hidden figures too. So in the book, they learn about these historical hidden figures and their remarkable accomplishments. But we also had the students have an opportunity to interact with some local hidden figures of Columbus. And so these were the three local hidden figures that donated their time to interview with our students and kind of share their story. So we have Dr. Kenny Asahu, who's an applied mathematician and data scientist at JP Morgan Chase. We have Dr. Anaya Ortiz, who's the Franklin County coroner who has a mathematical background. And then also we have Lynette Campbell, who's an engineer at Honda Manufacturing, who also has a mathematical background as well. So all three of our hidden figures, our local hidden figures is how we refer to them, have a mathematical background and have their own interesting and highly relevant stories for the students.
So I think just to kind of piggyback, the goal of the interactions with these external hidden figures, so to speak, was to give the students some insight into kind of common questions among undergraduates, which is, what can I do with a math major? What can I do with quantitative training? And then the more pervasive, how do I get there? And so going back to this idea of community, they were able to understand how personal and scientific communities really shape the opportunities of these three individuals to kind of understand the role that communities play in most people's professional journeys. And so the discussions with the local hidden figures ran parallel to discussions in the class that we were having about mathematical communities. In particular, how are they formed, and some of the myths surrounding what it means to be a mathematician.
Right, as Dr. Edmonds mentioned, this is kind of one of the things that we want to talk about is these ideas of mathematical communities. And here we have like three myths, and of course there are many different myths that we can list for mathematicians and math communities. So these are kind of like the three that we wanted to highlight today, and that were also talked about and discussed in the Hidden Figures book. So I guess one myth is that most mathematicians are geniuses or have a high IQ number, and so you have to have this genius level intellect to make a contribution to mathematics. That's a myth. Also maybe connected to that is that most mathematicians are child prodigies. They had an early recognition of their talent, that they just had a natural inclination towards mathematics. So that's another myth, that their mathematical brilliance was recognized by all. So that's kind of like the first myth that we wanted to unpack. Another myth is that successful mathematicians blaze their own trail. Like they're not really taught, or they're not really mentored. They're just so good that their contributions and their brilliance are just recognized. So that's another myth that we wanted to unpack and talk about. They just are, as we have it in the slide. And the third myth about math communities that we are going to be talking about today is that math communities, they form regardless of the social and cultural context. That maybe this is connected to the second one, that mathematicians are just so good that they find each other and they produce mathematics regardless of what's happening in the broader society. And this is maybe connected with the idea that if you look at a mathematical theorem, that supposedly a mathematical theorem is a statement that's true for all time. It kind of transcends human societies or human contexts in some way. So this is one of the other myths that we wanted to explore and talk about when we talk about hidden figures.
And just again, piggybacking, we were able to do this by utilizing discussion board forums through our campus's online platform, which is Canvas, and having the students kind of really unpack how they see themselves in a math community, or how their own mathematical journey has been influenced negatively or positively by these myths.
And so one of the things that kind of arose with our discussion with the students via the discussion boards and in our discussions in class, and then also reading the book, and also talking to the students about their interactions with their local hidden figures, is that we kind of form, here we just have these kind of 5 bullet points for this hidden figures view of a mathematical community. And there's more that we can say here, but these are kind of like the main points that we want to talk about today. And the first point is that communities, connections within and without the community matter. So there's not just like one lone person blazing a mathematical trail on their own. They need to be connected with others to kind of to interact with, to play off of, to work with. So it's just not this lone person working. It's a connection with a group of people in the community, and also without. The other thing that we'll be talking about in our talk today is about this access to what we call institutional power, and access to opportunities and mentorship and sponsorship also matters. And institutional power refers to both people in particular roles, so supervising positions or director positions that have the authority to assign people to certain roles and certain opportunities. And then we also, of course, just mean money. So people in director positions having access to budgets to be able to fund communities to support themselves and even to exist, to the equipment that they need to work. And then also, in addition to power, is that we'll be talking about later on in our talk today, is kind of legislative backing or political power or executive order power. So these are things that the large society signal that this matters to us, and is kind of enshrined in the laws of the government or enshrined in the executive orders provided by the federal government as how to direct their work. So this is one of the other things that really matters in the formation of communities. The other kind of hidden figure view of mathematical community is that your role and position in a community matters, and kind of mobility. So a vibrant community, what we saw was where an individual person not just kind of stuck and fixed in one role, but they have the opportunity to move around to different roles, whether become a supervisor or become an engineer in the community if they start out as a human computer, and we'll talk a bit about that a bit later, or even change context completely from the community. So they have that freedom to kind of have that self-determination of how they move in the community or get access to opportunities. And the last two are kind of connected, is that so the priorities in a community can shift over time. And we'll be illustrating this in our talk today, that a community is formed often for one task, but that task changes as time progresses. Like what's viewed as important is not the same thing always. It's always changing, always shifting. And then one of the other things that we saw that we'll illustrate is that we call it a paradox. There's this kind of consistent paradox of this slow social progress versus rapid scientific progress or advancement. And that's kind of illustrated with these 2 pictures here. One picture is illustrating the March on Washington for jobs and freedom. And the other picture is the rocket launch for John Glenn's space flight into space to orbit the Earth. And so you kind of have like this rapid development of a space program in the US very quickly with a lot of resources. And in a similar time, you have this, in the midst of the civil rights movement, and kind of pushing for more access to opportunities and justice, economic justice and societal justice in the United States as well.
So we've talked about one of our goals is to explore mathematical communities. And so we decided to do this through the particular lens of Dorothy Vaughn's story. So just starting to kind of illustrate the life and career that she had, she was born in Kansas City, Missouri. And when she was 2 years old, her mother passed away. And so she was raised by her stepmother, who was very diligent in her education and taught her to read and always encouraged her in her studies. Her family relocated to Morgantown, West Virginia when she was 8, and she attended the Beechhurst School. And she graduated at the age of 15 as a valedictorian. And so it's important to note here that she was invested in from an early age by parents who were able to see that she received an excellent education, and as well as from her church community. And so she received a scholarship from the African Methodist Episcopal Church to attend Wilberforce University, which is one of the country's oldest Black private colleges at the time, and had deep ties with the church. And so after this, it's just kind of interesting to note this intersectionality piece. So here is a Black female who has access to a college education, which is different than a lot of other Black females at the time, because only 2% of Black women had college degrees compared to 10% of white females, which still is not very good. And so in the Hidden Figures text by Margot Shetterly, she's kind of characterized as a hardworking, service-oriented, kind of no-nonsense woman. And so I kind of like noting some of the personal communities that Margot Shetterly was diligent in making sure to note that Dorothy was a part of. And so she was very active in her church, and she was also very active in Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority. So this is the first sorority established for Black collegiate women in 1908, and it was an organization that Dorothy remained active in throughout her life. And so I wanted to highlight this, not just because I'm an AKA, but just to show that she had established connections and personal networks outside of the scientific community. And so when we talked about this in our course, it kind of challenged this myth that you can't be well-rounded and pursue a mathematical education. So after she graduated from Wilberforce University, she was invited to participate in the first master's program in mathematics that was being established at Howard University by some real powerhouses. And so we actually conjecture that this is maybe the formation of one of the very first mathematical communities. It was a nucleus of Black excellence, mathematical excellence at the time. And when we think about these themes of communities, you know, they created their own institutional power through this historically Black college, Howard University, and they gave access to mathematical opportunities for talented African Americans. And the students in this program benefited from direct research, direct mentoring, by research mathematicians. So for just a little bit of history, it was established in 1929 by Dudley Woodard, and he was the second African-American person to get a PhD in mathematics. And in that same year, Elbert Cox, who was the first African-American to earn a PhD, who Talitha Washington talked about very eloquently last week, he started working at Howard, and the two of them started and kind of got this program off the ground. So in 1929, William Claytor, who was the third African-American male to earn a PhD, completed this one-year master's program at Howard before he had actually earned the doctorate. And so this is the same program that Dorothy had to turn down. And so we see this kind of lack of opportunity, this kind of lack of access to an opportunity that she didn't have as a woman that Claytor was able to take advantage of. And so this was because at the onset of the Great Depression, she figured it makes more sense for me to start working immediately than to go to school. And I think this is something that probably a lot of undergraduates, question that they've considered, anyone who's considered graduate school has kind of grappled with. So a couple of historical notes. So in 1944, David Blackwell was hired at Howard University and became the chair. And then he, in turn, hired William Claytor. And Blackwell would later leave for UC Berkeley in the Department of Statistics. And there is a much deeper story there than we don't have time to get into. But then one thing we want to note is that James A. Donaldson came to work at Howard in 1972. It was actually coming back. And so when he was the chair, he actually oversaw the formation of a doctoral program in mathematics, making it the first historically Black college to offer a PhD in the subject.
Yeah, and to say I'm a product of Howard University, so I earned my doctorate in mathematics at Howard University there. And I got my undergraduate degree at Texas A&M, and one of the reasons why I was interested and chose Howard to attend graduate school was because at the time, so there are now two other institutions, but at the time, as Dr. Edmonds mentioned, it was the only historically Black college that had a PhD program in mathematics. And when I was there, Jim Donaldson was the dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, and I had the opportunity to have a few conversations with him when he was swinging by the math department. So it's kind of very interesting, these direct connections that I have by virtue of going to Howard University and having these conversations with the kind of the beginnings of the Black mathematical community in that regard.
So we noted that Dorothy Vaughan was actually not able to participate in the master's program at Howard. And so she went on to teach. She moved to Farmville, Virginia, and she worked at Robert Russa Moton High School. So at this time, around 60% of African-American women with degrees became teachers. So 60% of that 2%, so a very small fraction. And this was considered upper level training. It was a very respected job in the Black community. So teacher, preacher, doctor, lawyer. And she worked various jobs. So anyone who's familiar with the Hidden Figures text, it kind of opens with Dorothy Vaughan working at a laundry facility called Camp Pickett. And this is something that she did when school was not in session, that she actually earned more money doing laundry than she did working at the school. And she earned around $850 a year at that time. So one thing to note, just to kind of highlight the intersection of Dorothy Vaughn's story with the larger social story of America, is that this particular school, in the picture that you see here, is actually a museum now. It's considered the birthplace of like American student revolution and civil rights. And this is because in 1951, there was a student-led strike protesting school conditions, and in particular overcrowding. So the school was built to have space for 180 students, but there were around 450. And so if you can imagine what that's like. And so they walked out, refused to attend classes for a couple of weeks, and they reached out to get support from the NAACP, which they got, under the condition that instead of framing their walkout around the context of we just need more space, framing it as this lack of space is a result of segregation itself. And so this court case actually ended up becoming absorbed into Brown versus Board of Education. And so it was a very historical moment. And so that schoolhouse has been preserved. And we thought it was neat to highlight that this is one of the first places that Dorothy Vaughan worked. And it also highlights how little bits of her story are kind of weaved into the greater American epic.
Yeah, just to kind of reemphasize is that, again, this is during a time, of course, where segregation was enshrined in law in many places. So this is pre-Brown versus Board of Education, as Dr. Edmonds mentioned. And so this American society was segregated both in fact and in law in many places.
And so just briefly talking about her personal life, she was married to Howard Vaughn in 1932. And we felt it was important to note that at the time, her family was considered a part of the social elite amongst Black Americans in Norfolk, Virginia. And so when we talk a lot about intersectionality in the course, we talk about how these intersections of your gender, your race, and your socioeconomic status kind of grant or shut you out from access to opportunities. And so in this case, and in the case of all the hidden figures featured in the text, they were a part of, I guess, what you would consider the upper class Black community at the time. And that's not something that we wanted to ignore. And you know, she had 6 kids. 4 of those she had before she began working at NACA, which transitioned to NASA, and then 2 she had after she started working there. And so just to kind of set the stage for NACA, most of us are familiar with NASA. But before it was NASA, it was NACA, and it was, which stands for the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. And it was just that, it was just a committee. It started with an initial committee. I think the committee was around 20 people initially. And their goal was just to direct the scientific study problems of flight and to figure out practical solutions. And so this was before the war, and so there was not actually a lot of national interest in aeronautics. It was considered just kind of a fun social pastime. But then once the war beefed up and they recognized the potential for victory through the air, it began to receive more support. And so it had an initial budget of $5,000, which is around $128,000 today adjusted for inflation. And they wanted to build a laboratory. And so they built Langley Research Center on the same campus as the US Army Air Corps. And because they had a very small amount of initial workers, there was a very research type culture of individual initiative. And so they were kind of called weirdos. They were known in the local community as just kind of weird people. In the story, they would it said that they would go into stores and take apart TVs and put them back together to see if they were really good. And so within the Hampton community, they were very distinct. And so we just wanted to highlight that this is kind of the setting that Dorothy Vaughan was about to enter. Ah, okay. I'm looking at my personal slides. Next slide. All right. So, so just a snapshot of society before Dorothy Vaughan begins to work at NACA. So America is at the height of World War II, and there are a lot of consequences of that. So one good consequence is that women started to enter the workforce. And because of this, the government saw fit to fund, there was kind of like a universal childcare effort because women were going to work and they didn't know what to do with their children. And these women included Black women as well. And so if you think about some of the positions outside of doctor, preacher, teacher, lawyer, it was housekeeper. And so there was no one to watch the kids. And so this is one of the first and maybe only times you see the government really investing in childcare, and this is kind of the advent of the modern daycare. There was also rationing efforts, which we felt were kind of interesting given the times. In particular, American soldiers were given 22 sheets of toilet paper a day compared to British soldiers, they received 3. But we talked about the humble origins of NACA. At this point, the aeronautics industry has gone from the 43rd leading industry to the world's #1 industry. And so there's a technological boom that is driving the growth of this community. Civil rights, so before there was Rosa Parks, there was Irene Morgan. And so in 1944, the year after Dorothy Vaughan began work at NACA, Irene Morgan refused to give up her Greyhound bus seat to white passengers. And in lighter news, the United States Forest Service campaign came out with their campaign of Only You Can Prevent Forest Fires. So if you've ever heard that before, that's the year that campaign came out. And then this is something just interesting to know. If we consider the growth of NACA, so in 1940, Malcolm McLean, who was the president of Hampton Institute at the time, oversaw the sale of over 770 acres of property for the federal government for use by Langley. And so it quickly grew to one of the largest air bases in the world. And he was often noted as saying that this war is the greatest break in history for minority groups because of the access to opportunities.
Yeah, and this is really illustrating kind of how the larger societal context is influencing the growth of this NACA community that will eventually become NASA. And this is, for me, one of the kind of exciting and interesting parts about the book is that you have World War II kind of being the catalyst for this large-scale reorganization of society to support the war effort, with kind of rethinking traditional society arrangements. Also, a lot of money provided by the federal government to retool and provide either childcare centers or support of new industries. And then also, as Dr. Edmonds mentioned, kind of like this rapid exponential growth of NACA to being aeronautics in the US being #1 by a short margin. And then also, there's this concept of what was called the double V, so 2 victories with World War II. And this kind of brings us to our next slide, is that the idea being that this is a space and opportunity for African Americans to push for greater access and more justice, because many African Americans either volunteered or were drafted to be soldiers in the war effort, or were contributing significantly into the war effort.
And so, like John was saying, there's, with regards to the war effort, there were millions of jobs that were being created. And so large groups of African Americans were moving to the north and moving to the west to seek careers and employment, but they were often met with hostility, with violence, with discrimination. And so this is right after the Great Depression. And so they're losing out on opportunities for training. And so we start to see this very intentional. We talked about communities and this notion of access and power for institutionally. And so in talking about the president of the country using his executive power to create some sort of social change. And so what ended up happening is to protest this lack of opportunity, A. Philip Randolph, along with the NAACP, called for an end to employment discrimination in defense industries. And so he organized a march with over 100,000 laborers who demanded fair and equal treatment, a march on Washington in 1941. And then a week before the march, they're like, okay, maybe let's not have a march of this epic proportion, because at the time, America was still trying to present a unified front to allies and not make it clear. And this kind of march would thwart that idea. And so they sat down and came to a compromise and signed Executive Order 8802. And so what this did was it prohibited discrimination in defense industries. And so, and then there was a subsequent order that established a committee to oversee that this actually took place and to try to get minorities more access to skilled jobs. And it wouldn't be until later when Truman was president that the military would be desegregated altogether. And so we see here the intersection of legislative policies that directly impacts the hidden figures, but it's kind of happening in the background. And so this is 1941. So this is just a couple of years before Dorothy Vaughan enters NACA. And the reason that she's able to is because of this executive order saying that we can no longer discriminate against African Americans when they try to apply for defense jobs.
And I guess there's a question, I guess, what were these jobs available in Langley and in NACA? And so we're going to talk about this in the next few slides. But I guess we want to kind of set the context of this ideal of human computer. So many of you may be familiar with computers, so iPhone, and you're watching this on some computer device probably now. But before there were these electronic digital computers, there were human computers. This actually referred to a job title. So this referred to a person whose job was to actually perform hand computation. So there wasn't any electronic device to assist them with. And at Langley, the role of human computers is that they would help collect measurements from the instrument. So here, this is a picture of a wind tunnel. So there will probably be like instruments connected to the plane here that they'll be collecting, and using differential equations to model out what this experiment is telling them. And around about the turn of the, I guess the 1930s, around about this time, is that there was kind of like this dramatic need for more people to do these computations because it was, in order to kind of do the simulation by hand, you just needed more and more and more people. At the time, as you see, this last bullet point here says women worked as computers and men worked as engineers. And so this is kind of like a gender view of this job, because it was viewed that human computers was viewed as low-level work for women, even though the work was like highly technical and highly skilled. So many of the women often had significant mathematical backgrounds, often undergraduate degrees in mathematics, maybe some had graduate degrees in mathematics at the time. And so it was a highly technical, highly skilled profession, but it didn't have enough, it didn't have that much prestige because it was thought of as primarily women's work.
So we just wanted to briefly talk a little bit about the physical infrastructure of human computing. So it used to be that this was kind of an industry that was outsourced, so you would just kind of do this in your home. And then with the advent of the aeronautics industry kind of booming, and then laboratory settings such as Langley, you needed a centralized computing offices. And so typically, you know, if you were a human computer that day, you would go into an office where things were kind of aligned in a certain sort of way. You'd have a space on your desk for books, and then you'd have be supplies with computing papers, which would you'd be given relevant tables, you'd be given computational tools, so maybe a desktop calculating machine, you would have a slide rule. And so when we think about one of the themes of the course that we were not going to explore into too much was this notion of mathematical tools. What were they actually using? And so one of those things was slide rules, which is what we later let the students learn how to use them. And we'll talk about that in a couple of slides from now.
Yeah, and also to point out, so this is a picture of Katherine Johnson, so one of the feature hidden figures who passed at the age of 101 early this year, I think in February. And so you can kind of see this ideal of what Dr. Evans was saying. So you see some books and then this kind of big thing that looks like a typewriter. So that's the mechanical calculator. And then you see, I guess, paperweights and the computing worksheets that she'll be working on here.
And then one thing I thought was, yeah, it was interesting just to note is that this was a very secretive thing that they were doing. It was there was, especially for those who were there during the Cold War, there was a high alert for spies. And so once they computed or did their calculations, the worksheets were destroyed or often burned. And so we don't actually have computing worksheets that exist today to kind of analyze deeply what it was they were actually doing and the kind of the standard setup of how they worked. So there's very few written accounts of how the worksheets were filled out. We do know that they used pencil for positive numbers, red for negative numbers, but these worksheets were typically, if you looked at them, just sequences of numbers. They were stripped of kind of any reference to physical settings or quantities or anything like this.
Yeah, this is one of the interesting things that kind of like this, how they actually did their work and the processes seem like it's a lost art that is kind of completely hidden now, very hard to uncover. And I guess to give you a sense of what these worksheets would look like, this is not connected to their work in aeronautics. This is actually from a book called Weather Prediction by Numerical Processes by Lewis Richardson, published in 1922. And on the kind of the right part of your screen, you'll see a proposed computing worksheet. So it's not clear to me if this was actually used by anyone. This was a worksheet included in the book by Richardson. In the book, just to give you a brief overview of it, he was proposing at the time that if you had a large enough group of human computers, then you can start to predict the weather. If you have enough measurements from around the globe, equally spaced around the globe, then you could just have people taking those measurements and starting to compute to predict what the weather would be like, say, the next day or the day after that. Of course, this is something that's very convenient for us now because we get the weather from our phones or on TV or from the computers. But this was kind of like an open problem at the time. How can you predict the weather? And so this worksheet, I kind of think of it as like you kind of think of Excel spreadsheets, so kind of printed out for that. These are proposed worksheets that he included in his book to say that if we get enough computers working on this problem, here's maybe one arrangement of how they would calculate or put their numbers down. So like each cell would be put a certain range of numbers and they'll be computing as they fill in those cells with the answer. As well as we can understand, I guess a typical worksheet actually probably wouldn't include these headers. So you kind of see certain headers like in the very top, like this equation here, and then in the middle kind of label heading here, they probably wouldn't be there. You'll probably see these lines as well. Again, I don't think this particular worksheet was ever used by any actual human computer because Richardson, I think, was pretty frank in the book. He said he actually didn't know the best way of organizing this work. This is just a tentative proposal for how you can do it. And he thought that once people start experimenting, that they will be able to come up with better ways of arranging how to do these computations. And one of the things that we did in our course is that we wanted to give our students a sense of what the human computers kind of did day to day. And so we actually had them role play being a human computer. And so in this particular activity that we had the students do is that we had them fill out like our own pre-made, not pre-made, or fill out a worksheet with these instructions here. So you see that you have a capital A is equal to 3, and then you have a number C, which starts out to be 1. And then they kind of fill it out from left to right, and then they go down from top to bottom here. And what this particular worksheet is computing is the square root of 3. And the algorithm that they're actually implementing by hand here is a very old algorithm called the Babylonian method. So it's over probably 4,000 years old by this point. So old algorithm mathematics. This picture on the far right that you see is kind of like a front-facing view of this kind of typewriter type thing. So this is a mechanical calculator that we saw earlier in this picture with Captain Johnson. So we weren't able to acquire a mechanical calculator in the class itself. We did tell the students about them, but this was an example of something that many human computers had access to on their desks.
So just briefly talking about the tools that we did have access to, and I saw one of the questions in the chat was what did we use some of the money for? Some of the money went towards the acquisition of a classroom set of slide rules of various sorts. And so if you can kind of see, this is just me versus the PowerPoint, but we acquired post 1460 Versalock slide rules. These are engineering grade slide rules that allow you to do a wide variety of computations. And we got these from the International Slide Museum and worked with their curator, which is located in Colorado. And if you see in the photo, it's Dr. Johnson and myself putting together a demonstration rule that had actually cracked on its way to being shipped to us. And so we were shipping it back. And so we had to take it apart. It was 8 foot? It was 8 feet?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. And then a picture of the slide rule that I just pulled out in person, the post 1460 Versalogs. So this is an example of the kind of computational tools that they had at that time. Okay, so getting back to Dorothy Vaughan, so we want to just briefly talk about the West Computing Group. So Dorothy saw an ad for a position at Langley at a post office. That post office was in proximity to State Teachers College in Farmville, which is a white female college. And so it probably was not intended for her to see, but she applied, and once she was accepted, once she was granted the position, she left her job at the Robert Rooston Moton High School. And so at that time, we said she was earning $850 a year. The pay at Langley was $2,000. And so it was something that she felt she couldn't say no to. And then once again, she took this job 2 years after the executive order for against discrimination in the defense industry. And so one thing to note, though, is that even though they were able to work at Langley, they were in a remote area in a warehouse building. And a lot of the other staff at Langley were not aware that there was a West Computing Group just because of their physical proximity. They did receive training 2 days a week after work on aerodynamics. They received hands-on training in the wind tunnels. There was a picture of a wind tunnel a couple of slides back. And they were given instructions from the engineers on what equations to use to process the data that they were sent. So they were involved in the work and still yet separate. One thing that we wanted to know is that when Dorothy took the job, she just thought it'd be temporary. It wasn't meant to last past the war, but she ended up staying. And then in 1947, East Computing, which was the all-white female group, was disbanded, which meant that all computing assignments were now rerouted to the West computers. And they had a reputation for being meticulous, precise, and kind of on it. So one thing I just wanted to know is that the students were like, their minds were kind of blown by the fact that she did take the job. Because at this point in her life, she had 4 children that did not come with her right away, and she couldn't commute home on the weekends. And so, in general, if you say, hey, honey, I have a job position, you watch these 4 kids, I'm gonna go, do math at this research center. Usually the answer is like, oh, that doesn't sound like a great idea for our family, but this was an opportunity that she felt that she had to take, particularly after passing up the graduate program earlier to work immediately.
Yeah, and then also to kind of comment on this, the picture here. So if you see the headlines, it's paving the way for women engineers. And for those of you that read the Hidden Figures text, that's another major theme kind of early in the book about this transition from being recognized as mathematicians and then also being recognized as engineers. And so there was a difference in kind of prestige within NACA at the time between these two roles. And there was a barrier that had to be broken there. That one of the hidden figures that we'll mention later, of course, became an engineer, transitioned to be an engineer.
And so we said that she became a permanent employee, and then East Computing disbanded. And so in 1949, the original, the section head was Marjorie Hanna, and then she gave that position to Blanche Sponsler, but she experienced mental health issues that prevented her from carrying out her duties. It was actually a very sad story about how people responded to mental health at that time. But effectively, this meant that Dorothy became acting head of West Computing, the interim, so to speak. And it took 2 years, and they never found a replacement for Blanche Sponsler. And so she became the permanent shift supervisor. And so she was in this role from 1949 to 1958 until NACA became NASA. And one thing we want to note is that this role essentially increased her visibility at Langley. And so we mentioned before that they were kind of in this separate kind of quarters. And now that she was a supervisor, she was responsible for understanding the needs of the engineers and distributing those assignments to her computers appropriately. And so she had to kind of intermingle with different people within Langley. So she became very politically savvy, because not only did she have to understand what the engineers wanted, sometimes they required special assignments. And so they would try to pull a computer to come work with them for a particular period of time. And so she had to kind of understand the temperaments of different women to see, okay, is this person going to be a good fit? And then also she was able to get her own professional opportunities. And so she ended up working with the East Computing, one of the East computers, Sarah Bullock, on a textbook for using the Monroe calculating device, which we have an image of, an example of one to the right here. And so she was able to participate and literally write the book on how to use some of the machines at Langley.
Yeah, and kind of speaking to this third point about the textbook, unfortunately, we haven't been able to find this textbook anywhere, at least online. And so this will be like a point, especially when we talk about Dorothy Vaughn's legacy in a few slides about her contributions to this remarkable group of women. Now, in her role as supervisor, so there's this transition from NACA to NASA. And so to kind of set the context for this, so in 1957, the Soviet Union launched a Sputnik, which was an artificial satellite to orbit the Earth. And this caused a kind of a panic in American society. It was the belief that America was very much behind the Soviet Union with regard to science and technology and engineering, and that there needed to be like a massive investment of resources in people to build up America's capacity in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So this was kind of like like a wake-up call for America that this should be a new priority for society. And so in reaction to this, NACA transitioned to NASA, which is what many of us know today, to try to get into the space race, to try to put people in orbit around Earth, eventually get people to the moon and beyond. And in this transition, the West Computing Group was disbanded. And so here in parentheses, you see we put that NASA was to be an integrated organization. And just to remind you that the executive order that Dr. Edmonds mentioned provided that there would be no discrimination in many federal agencies. So basically it meant that African Americans should be considered for jobs that they applied for. But it wasn't necessarily given that they will be integrated with others doing those work. And so we kind of mentioned this with West Computing Group, the African American Women Mathematician, and East Computing Group, the white women computing group. But in NASA, the idea was to be integrated. And so West Computing was disbanded. Now at the time, as Shirley kind of documents in her book, many of the West computers had already either moved on to more specialized assignments. Either they were assigned to other engineering groups. And so there weren't that many human computers left in the West Computing Group. So kind of Dorothy Vaughan and a few others. And so people were kind of moved into other positions from that. And also happening with this was this transition to electronic computers. So here, this was kind of like the beginning of the kind of the digital computer age. Along with Fortran. So Fortran is a type of programming language. Many of you maybe have programming experience, maybe not with Fortran, but maybe with Python or C, or the programming language R, or some of the more popular languages now. But Fortran was one of the early computer programming languages that enabled you to easily program a digital computer to perform some algorithm. And here on the left-hand side, this is not Fortran, this is just pseudocode, which is kind of like a more high-level description of how algorithm works for that method that we talked about last time. So the Babylonian method for computing the square root of a positive number, A, here, which is with a particular guess. I'm not going to go through the steps of this. This is just kind of to illustrate that you had to have some kind of recipe and be able to translate this recipe into a language that the computer will understand. And one of the things that Dorothy Vaughan did in this transition, even before the transition, is that she taught herself the programming language Fortran, and she taught many of the West computers and former West computers how to do computer programming too. So in a certain sense, kind of preparing them for the future when the West computing would be disbanded and West human computation wouldn't be as needed. And this is illustrated very vividly in the movie's Hidden Figures, where there's a scene in the movie where she takes the Fortran book from the library, and as a Black woman, she didn't have access to the library, so she literally had to take it. And she taught herself the book, and then she taught the other Hidden Figures how to program these computers. And here's this last bullet point. Dorothy, when she transitioned out of West Computing when it was disbanded, she was reassigned to the Analysis and Computation Division. And so she was no longer a supervisor for the group. She kind of went back to a more computational or support role. And then I guess there's a quote that I did want to read here that is kind of indicative of this transition here. And so remember I said that earlier that human computers were primarily women, because it was thought of as like low prestige work, even though it was highly technical, highly skilled work. But I just wanted to kind of read this quote here about this transition from human computation to digital computation. The function of computing had been promoted from an all-female service organization with minimal hardware requirements to a top-level division with an 8-figure operating budget. It was starting to look a lot more like a launch pad and a career path to ambitious young men. It also signaled the beginning of the end of computing as women's work. And so with this transition to digital computation, computing became a more prestigious position. Being a programmer became a more prestigious position and thought of as a one step along a long career path. Whereas before, being a human computer was just kind of thought of as that's the job. There's very little room to transition out of that to other positions.
And so just to kind of briefly connect the dots between Dorothy Vaughan and some of the other Hidden Figures, well, in the movie, the timelines are kind of compacted a bit for theatrics, but in actuality, they weren't riding to work together. Dorothy was at Langley before any of the other women. And so if you think about Christine Darden, for instance, who was the 4th Hidden Figure mentioned in the book, who wasn't featured in the movie, when she first got to Langley, she reported to former West computers who previously reported to Dorothy Vaughan. Mary Jackson eventually got an assignment in engineering, and she was actually the one who complained about the bathrooms to her supervisor, not Katherine Johnson, as was in the movie. And then Katherine Johnson specifically arrived to Langley, and then 2 weeks later, Dorothy Vaughan sent her to the Flight Research Division, and the rest is history. And in particular, there was a rule that said, hey, if a computer is within a division for a specific period of time with a group of engineers, then she either moves there permanently or she comes back. And so Dorothy Vaughan waited until double that amount of time and then said, hey, either give her a promotion or give her back. And so she was directly responsible for the promotions of many women within Langley Research Center.
And I guess to kind of go to, I guess, Dorothy Vaughan's legacy and kind of the end of her career very quickly. So she was passed over his head for the section of this Analysis and Computation Division and decided to retire in 1971. So this was like soon after the moon landing. And with the moon landing, there was the budget for NASA was reduced. And so a lot of people were getting reassigned or effectively being laid off. And so in this case, Dorothy Vaughan decided to retire after many years of service.
And these are some photos from her retirement party. Well, there were. But okay, so if we just kind of talk about her legacy, so in many ways, even though she was a primary figure in the text and in the film, her legacy was somewhat hidden historically, at least compared to some of the other prominent women in the story, Mary Jackson, Katherine Johnson, and Christine Darden. And so she was noted by Marjorie Hanna, who was the first supervisor of works computing, that she was extremely smart. She didn't get half the credit that she deserved. But in particular, one thing that resonated with us is that Margot Shetterly first learned about Dorothy Vaughan, not through her research, but through interviewing Katherine Johnson. Katherine Johnson referred to her as Dot Vaughn and talked about how smart she was and what a great worker she was. And so this kind of brings up this idea of what gives your work a sort of timelessness in STEM community. And so we talked to our students a lot about the importance of authorship. We noticed earlier that she would participate in a handbook, creation of a handbook for algebraic methods for that Monroe calculating machine, but nobody, received credit for that work. The company in general, most of their handbooks that we were able to find through archives don't have acknowledgments to the authors, and the ones that do exist are to men. And so even though her role as a supervisor gave her the ability to advance the careers of others, like Katherine Johnson, in the same way, she wasn't able to become a permanent part of a specialized engineering team, which would have given her the opportunity to co-author technical reports and leave a more substantial in terms of mathematical legacy that we could get our hands on. And so there's kind of a bittersweetness to her story in that regard. And so we felt that this quote was just very poignant, and we wanted to end with this. To just note that this is a woman who we can kind of see the story. We kind of used her to go through kind of a certain period of American history, but she is someone who's directly responsible for the careers of countless women that came behind her. And for that, we just wanted to celebrate her and her story. And this is something that we had the students reflect on a lot during the course, once again, with these discussion posts and in class conversations.
Yeah, and just to wrap up and draw a connection with what's happening today is that, as we mentioned, that there was this kind of constant tension and paradox between slow social progress and scientific progress. And this is, there was a kind of very timely illustration of this with the launch of the SpaceX rocket, the first rocket to be launched in the US in a long time to dock with the International Space Station, occurring in late May, simultaneously with protests arising from the killing of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and many, many, many others. And that's also culminated in this hashtag #ShutDownSTEM that many of you may be familiar with.
So thank you for joining us today. And I guess we'll turn it back over to Edre. Not sure how much time is left for further discussion.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, yeah, well, thank you very much. That really was a wonderful presentation. I know that I have a lot of questions, but I think first let me encourage others to put their questions in the question and answer window, and we'll try to go with them. So we're at about an hour, but I think I still want to take another 5-10 minutes, try to go through some questions here. So I think that there's a lot of interesting things that you've both said that I certainly would like to follow up on a little bit more. So definitely thank you very much for a wonderful talk here. One thing I wanted to ask you about is some things that you said here over the last few slides. This thing of maybe Dorothy Vaughn's life was somewhat bittersweet, and some of the things that either she did not accomplish or was not allowed to accomplish. I know when I read through Margot Shetterly's book, it definitely struck me just a lot of the sadness that seemed to come about with what Dorothy Vaughan was starting to do earlier in her career, not finishing the master's program at Howard, but then this whole debate that she had of, should she start working there for NACA? Should she stay at home and take care of her kids? I'm just wondering, even in the course that you have, do you spend a lot of time maybe talking about Dorothy Vaughan in general, whether she felt any regrets, whether she was upset about anything that happened in her life, whether there are things that she would have done differently? I'm just wondering just how you might focus on some of the regrets, some of the bad things that happened.
So in particular, getting into the class setup. So what we did was on Mondays, this is a class that was offered Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So on Mondays and Wednesdays, we would, do different things that were more primarily mathematical, teach a certain operation on the slide rule, et cetera. And then on Fridays, we would have a discussion day. And so we mentioned we did discussion board posts. Those would be due on Wednesdays, and then a response to a classmate would be due on Thursday, so that on Friday we had time to kind of unpack the discussion board posts and then use those responses to initiate our class discussion, because the students had already kind of given thought to the questions that we were wanting to ask. And so this is actually a theme that came up a lot. Our class was, it was majority female. And so there were this story of, giving up something to pursue your professional exploits, I think is something that came up and that they discussed a lot. And then in particular, we would have reading quizzes that they had to do online. And some of those included open response questions where we would say, reflect on this according to a particular theme. So this will be a theme of intersectionality, how did the gender and Dorothy's race and gender play a role in perhaps this particular decision. And that was kind of how we incorporated these discussions in the larger framework of the course.
Mm-hmm. Okay, all right, thanks. In fact, I wanted to ask you more specifically about maybe some of the things that you did talk about there in the course. In particular, the idea of a slide rule. I imagine that a lot of students nowadays have never seen a slide rule, have no idea what it is. Maybe for the audience, can you say, what is the slide rule? What does it do? What are some things you can compute with it?
Yeah. So I don't have a slide rule handy on me, but yeah. So it's basically a tool. So it looks like a ruler, many of them, or they come in different configurations where you can perform multiplications with them easily. And how it works is that it uses logarithms. So the properties of logarithms to convert multiplicative problems into additive problems. And so that's kind of like the basis of it. And during the course, we actually taught the students how to read from slide rules. So like a ruler, they have like different scales on them. In like the middle part, you can move them back and forth. And so we taught them if they wanted to multiply two numbers, how would they manipulate the slide rule to read off the numbers there. The slide rules that we let the students borrow, they can also compute trigonometric functions. So they can compute sine and cosine and tangent from them. They can also do exponentiation. So say 3 squared, they can compute that. They can also compute the square root of a number. So the slide rule can actually do, it was almost like it was a pocket calculator for a lot of people.
Right. Yeah. I also wanted to ask you about maybe some specific things that Dorothy Vaughan worked on when she first got to NACA. So I'm going to see if I get my dates here right. So she started working for the Youth Computing Group in 1943. And my understanding is that Chuck Yeager broke the sound barrier in 1947. Do you have an idea, did Dorothy Vaughan and her group work on some of these issues with supersonic travel? Maybe what were some of the very specific things that she might have worried about computing when she first got there to NACA?
Let's see, I'm trying to find, I feel like, so in terms of the era of supersonic, like that sort of research is more Christine Darden's era. So this would be later on after, I guess, the height of the space race. So it's not something that the West Computing Group, as we know in the text, would have been concerned about. This is something that they explored when they had more advanced technology within Langley. But that's a good question. In terms of what specific, so at this time, this was like 1946. So in the 1940s, there was a lot of what they were working on was optimization for plane like shape. So this is around the time where they, and this is something that Dorothy Hoover, who's been talked about by several, Eureka Wilson and others, they were coming up with a theory of a certain airplane wing shape, a delta-shaped airplane wing. So they used these wind tunnels. Essentially, the idea was that you can either test how a plane moves through the air, or you can have a plane sitting still and have air move over it. And those two things are going to be the same. And so what they were doing was really trying to refine the shapes of different sorts of machines. And so, for instance, one thing they mentioned in the text is that Dorothy was directly involved in with the computations related to the bomber planes that were ultimately used for catastrophic devastation. And so this is a time where everything is kind of there. It's like everything's kind of beginning at Langley. So but I think in that time period, and I don't have my course notes, and I'm just kind of riffing, but they were mainly focused on the creation of different sorts of fighter planes, and optimizing those for war efforts.
I see. Okay, all right. I got a request from our moderator here. If you could maybe stop sharing your screen so we could see both your faces a little bit better. Let me maybe move on a little bit to ask more about like her legacy, and then I do want to ask some questions about her class. You mentioned that she was born in Virginia, but she went to Wilberforce. And I know the Wilberforce is an HBCU there in Ohio. Um, does Ohio State have any kind of formal ties with Wilberforce? Have you personally talked to anyone there about the class that you have, maybe to focus a little bit more on Dorothy Vaughn's life and legacy?
No, well, I guess to say that there are no formal ties right now. I have some family friends that when I moved to Columbus that I don't have connection to Wilberforce. So yeah, no formal ties right now. But
that's okay. A wonderful idea.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. Okay, yeah, I know that not a lot of people know about Wilberforce, but you know it is there in Ohio, and I think it's one of the HBCUs that's the furthest west, you know, in the country. But certainly, you know, I was wondering if there are ties there. We've gotten a few questions here in the chat window about the class that you have, and I do want to try to go a few of these here. The first question is from Jamil Carter that I'll ask here. Can you say a bit more about the logistics of the class? For example, how is it listed in the course catalog? Was it listed as a special topics course?
So this is the questions that it's still a work in progress, right? But so initially, this was piloted as it was just a pilot version of a course. And so the students who took it last semester signed up for it without the promise of any sort of credit towards graduation that would check off a specific box in the sense of it's a general elective or it counts towards a math minor. And so that's kind of part of our ongoing efforts is to get it to check the right box to appeal to the student group that we're trying to get at, which would be underclassmen in particular, because we feel like that's a really good time to start asking these questions of what can I do with a math major? What skills do I need? Here are some people who I can talk to that can tell me their stories. And so we're right now positioning it as a social diversity in the US GE, as well as a cultural ideas and study GE. And we're currently working on that paperwork. And so I guess is that the idea is how we framed it. So it's within the math department, but actually right now does not count towards the math degree or like the math major. It's the only math course that's a general elective that doesn't count for the math elective, if that makes sense.
Okay, yeah, that does. Okay, another question here, also from Jamil Carter, is about the internal grants that you received to run the course. And I think that you mentioned a little bit earlier that you did receive $10,000 in internal grants to do this. And you spent a little bit of the money, I believe you said, for the slide rules that you purchased. Can you say a little bit more about other things you might have purchased or even other things you used some of the grant for to help design the course?
Yeah, so some of the money that we originally had budgeted for the course was, and also I guess I should say that some of those things that didn't happen this semester because of the switch to remote instruction. So some of the money was kind of earmarked for students needed to get materials. So one part of the course that we didn't really mention that much was this community outreach part, this community engagement. So we have a partnership with the Columbus Metropolitan Library System where the students themselves would kind of serve as their examples of hidden figures to the students in the libraries. And so they will be developing STEM programming there. And so part of the money was also earmarked for kind of materials for the students that they would need for their STEM programming. We had to kind of change what they would do because of remote instruction. The other kind of part that we had earmarked for was we originally had in mind kind of ending the course with some type of celebration of kind of like the local hidden figures and kind of all that the students had discovered. So kind of like just kind of a small reception or kind of get together or presentation there. Again, that part of the course we didn't run because of the switch to remote instruction. And so of course, as we go on, we're still like tweaking, you know, how we're going to modify this to match with the new realities.
Right. We still have a big pot of money that is unused.
Okay. Then let me ask you maybe this as a follow-up. You mentioned they're working with the local community. How did you find the local hidden figures there in the Columbus area? So you mentioned a little bit towards the beginning, but I'm just wondering about that.
That was actually challenging. So a lot of this initially came through just not, I don't want to say luck, but networks. And so, for instance, the in the Office of Diversity and Inclusion here at OSU, we sent out, and we crafted an email blast to send. We're searching for hidden figures for our new course, and so it happened that when people saw those email blasts that we knew personally, then they tended to forward them along, or, oh, I know of a person who would be great. And so in particular, this is how we were able to get linked up with the Franklin County Coroner's Office and Dr. Ortiz there. The person at JP Morgan Chase, Dr. Salau, was a contact from another postdoc here. And then Lynette Campbell was someone that we actually received her information through our campus outreach person. Felt like there's a person who is in charge of like community engagement and outreach, and so we reached out to that office, and then they gave her her name. So it sounds a kind of ad hoc, but the follow up to that is that once those individuals kind of signed up, it gave us access to, I guess, their networks, and so we've had other conversations that have had to be put on pause because of COVID for broader partnerships with Honda, where Lynette works. We had conversations earlier this last semester since COVID happened with the Center of Science and Industry here in Columbus with their CEO. He's a Black male who has a undergraduate bachelor's degree in mathematics, who went on to earn a PhD, not in mathematics, and is now the director of a science museum. And so he's someone who said that he would agree to be a hidden figure in the future for our course. And so I guess it's one of those things, like once we got a couple, we learned of other areas where we could reach out. Right now we're gearing for the local tech community because it's pretty poignant. And there's a lot of corporate headquarters here in Columbus. And so we're still just waiting for the right kind of access into those settings to be able to find some people to volunteer their time, and hoping that once that happens, it'll start to ripple effect, and then we'll just get people volunteering without a lot of effort on our part.
Right, right. Yeah, yeah. Hopefully that will happen. So I think that we're going to need to cut it off here since we're already about 15 minutes over. But I want to thank the two of you again just for your time and for just giving us wonderful stories here. But I really look forward to seeing how this course is going to pan out. Sounds like it's been a fascinating experience so far, and the students will really love it in the future.
Thank you so much for having us, and thank you everyone for attending.
Yes, thank you.